Can't go on? So this topic, you might think, is this topic relevant to economists, students, and professors of economics here in Vietnam? It's about China, and it's about a decade of the 2000s, which is 15, 16, 17 years ago, right? Well, yeah, the previous decade. I think it is relevant to Vietnam because what I'm going to be talking about is the formal name is sterilized foreign exchange intervention, which I will explain what that is, unless you know. I'm sure you all are familiar with that term. It's also known as exchange rate protection. That is using exchange rate policy to gain competitive advantage in the world market. And it is also known as, in the popular world, I'm clicking buttons, but not. Oh, there we go. Currency manipulation. I don't know how to say manipulation in Vietnamese. Is it loyal or not? Manipulation, to manipulate. In Vietnamese. Loyal. Làm dụng. Okay, làm dụng.
Thao túng.
Thao động. Thao động tiền tế. Thao động tiền tế. Okay. I don't know the word. That's why I'm not giving this lecture in Vietnamese. I don't have vocabulary. So, in the United States, for example, and many other countries around the world, there's a big issue about currency manipulation. Maybe you've heard of someone named Donald Trump. He uses this word all the time, currency manipulation. He accuses China of currency manipulation. He accuses Japan, Taiwan, Malaysia, Thailand. He even would include Vietnam. He accuses Germany of currency manipulation. All of those countries have a surplus against the with the United States. They export more than they import. And to Donald Trump's way of thinking, this is a clear indication that they are cheating. They're not playing by the rules of the game. They're manipulating the currency. Manipulating the currency. And I'm going to explain today that China did, for one decade of the 2000s, manipulate the currency for its advantage, for its own selfish gain at some cost. Everything in economics has cost and benefit. My favorite saying in economics is, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. No problem can be solved. Nothing can be done to help some people who may have a problem without hurting someone else. There's always, for every benefit, a cost. Universal. So there are no solutions. You say, how do we solve this problem? Well, these people are suffering. How do we help them? Well, we can help them. We can find subsidy to give them, but it's going to hurt somebody else. We have to pay for the subsidy. So you have to make a trade-off. Is the welfare gain to those who benefit greater than the welfare loss to those who suffer? Always somebody has to suffer. Yeah. So we're going to be looking at the cost and the benefit to China, and at the end of the lecture to the United States, of China's policy of currency manipulation, exchange rate protection, and sterilized foreign exchange intervention all turn out to be the same thing. They're all the same thing. So the question I ask is, when a country intervenes in when a country, a central bank usually, intervenes in the foreign exchange market to buy or sell foreign exchange, and by doing that, to alter the price of foreign exchange. That's why central banks intervene, for the most part, in the foreign exchange market, to buy or to sell foreign exchange to influence the price. The price depends upon supply and demand. And the central bank can use its policy to change the supply or demand of foreign exchange. It can supply foreign exchange from its foreign reserve holdings, or it can demand foreign exchange, buy foreign exchange, and put them into its foreign exchange holdings. And by doing that, it influences the exchange rate. All countries that manage or pay or fix their exchange rate are intervening on a regular basis in the foreign exchange market. Countries that float their currency don't intervene. So this story is only about countries that fix or pay their exchange rate to the value of another currency or a basket of currencies. And many, many, many countries do that. Not all countries. A century ago, but even more than that, before 1914, most countries fixed the value of their currency to gold. It was called the gold standard. And by fixing their currency to gold, they fixed their exchange rate to every other country. That was the system. And it required intervention, buying and selling gold, in order to maintain the fixed exchange rate. After the Second World War, after the Great Depression, many countries abandoned fixed exchange rates and let their currencies float, like Canada, Japan, and other countries. Many developing countries, however, retained the policy of fixing their exchange rate, intervening. So, is intervention, that is the government, going into the foreign exchange market, does that constitute manipulation? What's the word again for manipulation? Not Neuen. Taudum. Has a bad term. It's a bad connotation. I manipulate someone means I make them do what they don't want to do for my benefit. I manipulate. I use my power to take advantage of them. Manipulate. It's a bad word. And it's used nowadays all the time to refer to countries that have fixed exchange rates and are successful, have surpluses in their trade balance. The American president, not just the one we have now, the one we had before. And many people around the world call this currency manipulation. Now, is foreign exchange, market intervention, currency manipulation? So, what I did is I went to Wikipedia. Where else do you go when you want to know something? You go to Google and you put in currency manipulation, and you get Wikipedia on the first hit. And this is what Wikipedia says. Currency intervention, also known as foreign exchange market intervention, or currency manipulation, is a monetary policy operation. It occurs when a government or central bank buys or sells foreign exchange for their own domestic currency, generally with the intention of influencing the market. That's what people, that's the most common definition. Even economists use this definition. And I'm going to argue this definition is nonsense. Why? Because in the 19th century, all countries fixed their exchange rate. All countries intervened. The world worked very well under the gold standard. After the Bretton Woods, after the Second World War, we established something called the Bretton Woods system. That's where all countries, by and large, pegged their currency to the dollar, fixed to the dollar. And those countries and their central banks had to go into the foreign exchange market in their country and buy and sell dollars from commercial banks to keep equilibrium in the market. They were intervening. Was that manipulation? No. That's how the system works. So that definition is just, has no content, doesn't mean anything. But that's the way people think. That's what Donald Trump thinks. Whenever the Central Bank of China buys or sells foreign currency to influence the RMB exchange rate, he calls that manipulation. They have a fixed exchange rate. Vietnam has a fixed exchange rate. Vietnam is also accused as being a currency manipulator. In the TPP negotiations, a big issue was currency manipulation. And if currency manipulation is just the central bank entering the market to influence the price, then every country is a currency manipulator, right? But in economics, we have, and many economists don't even recognize this, we have a more precise definition for what is currency manipulation. Currency manipulation occurs, according to my former colleague and esteemed colleague, Max Corden, when that intervention in the foreign exchange market is sterilized. Sterilized. And sterilization occurs when the central bank conducts two offsetting transactions. When it buys foreign exchange, it's putting more domestic currency in the bank. And then, if at the same time it sells bonds to the bank, it takes that currency out. So it sterilizes or prevents the monetization of foreign exchange intervention. And that is not playing by the rules of the fixed rate system. And that could be legitimately called currency manipulation, or a more technical term, exchange rate protection. Now, let's just get into the weeds a little bit and look at the more precise definition of sterilized intervention. This only applies for countries that peg or fix their exchange rate. Countries that float their exchange rate, of course, the policy is not to intervene. That could be the definition of a floating exchange rate system, like the United States has, Japan has sometimes, mostly. Is that your policy is not to intervene. But if your policy is not to intervene, then you have a policy of intervention. To buy and sell foreign exchange to keep the price at the target level, pay the rate. So this only applies to countries that have a policy of trying to fix or manage the exchange rate. Some countries don't fix or manage their exchange rate. The EU does not fix or manage its exchange rate, the euro. The dollar, US doesn't do it. Many large countries don't do it. Many people want more countries to follow the floating exchange rate regime, like China. China wants to be a global currency, a reserve currency. To do that, it would have to float its exchange rate. That is not intervene. Okay, but many countries, especially developing countries, find it to their advantage to fix the exchange rate, to intervene. Does that mean they are manipulating the currency for their own benefit to the expense of others? No. But it might, if they sterilize. So, what do we say here? When the central bank buys or sells foreign exchange, its assets go up and down. If it buys foreign exchange, its foreign reserves go up. Foreign reserves are an asset of the central bank. And as the central bank's assets go up, the base of the money supply goes up. And eventually the money supply goes up. And when the money supply goes up, we know from the quantity theory of money that eventually the price level will go up. Okay? That's a fact. So the money supply in any country is, a narrow definition, the currency in circulation, which is a liability of the central bank. I think if you look on your Vietnam banknotes, you'll see it's a liability, a debt that the State Bank of Vietnam has to you. This is an IOU. State Bank owes me $1,000. I'm not going to get it paid back. I'm going to use it to buy something, not much. And bank deposits. Okay? They're also part of the money supply in today. Okay? Commercial banks are required in most countries, including Vietnam, to hold some fraction. I use a symbol RRR, reserve requirement ratio, of their deposits. They have to hold it, save it in the state bank. It's called required reserves. Okay? Now, the money supply is therefore, that is, the currency and deposits in the banking system, is a multiple of the central bank's assets, its balance sheet. That's called base money or reserve money, different names for it. It's the base, the foundation for the money supply, which is the stuff we use every day to conduct transactions, taking money in and out of our deposits and in and out of our pockets. Okay? So here, just algebraically, you can see the money supply, by this narrow definition, is currency in circulation, money in your pocket, deposits in the banking system, which is an asset to you, a liability to the commercial banks, and that's equal to currency in circulation plus the ratio of required reserves to the reserve requirement ratio. Because required reserves are RRR times deposit. So 10%, 20%, 40% in Vietnam. The central banks often change this reserve requirement ratio to conduct monetary policy. So that means that the money supply is a multiple H, something greater than 1, of the liabilities of the central bank. Currency in circulation, as I said here, is a liability of the central bank. Yep. It even says here, Vietnam, they owe everyone who owns these notes some value of the note. That's a liability of the central bank. And the required reserves that are held by the central bank are also a liability of the central bank to the commercial banks, which are liability to people who hold deposits. So this is the liability side of the central bank's balance sheet. And of course it's equal to the asset side, credits and debits, right? Which is foreign held assets, foreign exchange assets, assets in foreign exchange, and assets in domestic currency. Usually this is just government debt. Okay? So this is the liabilities of the central bank is equal to the assets of the central bank by accounting, double entry accounting, always true. And so that means that the money supply is a multiple of the base money. And so when the base money goes up and down, for example, when the central bank buys and sells foreign reserves, the base money goes up and down. And as the base money goes up and down, the money supply goes up and down. And according to the quantity theory of money, the price level will go up and down, rising when the money supply is expanding and falling when the money supply is contracting. And this E, what's that? That's the real exchange rate. The real exchange rate is the ratio of domestic prices to foreign prices, expressed in a common currency. E is the nominal exchange rate. So the reserves go up and down, base money goes up and down, money supply goes up and down, price level goes up and down, exchange rate, the real exchange rate. Not the nominal exchange rate is fixed, but the real exchange rate, the purchasing power of money, goes up and down when the central bank intervenes in the foreign exchange market. Now that's the way the fixed rate system works. So when you intervene, fix the nominal exchange rate, it doesn't necessarily keep the real exchange rate, which expresses your price competitiveness in the world market, fixed. Because there are two mechanisms that work. One is changes in the nominal exchange rate, and the other is changes in prices that affect your competitiveness. And that's why a fixed rate system works, because if a country has a surplus and it buys up foreign exchange, the excess supply of foreign exchange, its money supply will go up. And that will push up its prices, and that will push down its competitiveness. Right? In a floating rate system, it works automatically at the border. If you have an excess supply, your currency appreciates nominally, and your competitiveness declines to the equilibrium level. In a fixed rate system, it works through the level of prices, not through the nominal exchange rate. That's the international monetary system. Two ways for the monetary system to work, with fixed rates and with floating rates. Both work if they're allowed to work. Sterilizing foreign exchange intervention is prohibiting the mechanism from working. So, if at the same time the central bank is buying foreign currency, it conducts an offsetting transaction, selling government bonds or its own bonds, then it is preventing the money supply from going up and down with the reserves going up and down. And therefore, it's manipulating the foreign exchange market. It's cheating on the rules of the fixed rate regime. It's trying to keep or avoid losing that competitive advantage. Yeah.
I received a paper sterilized interventions without purchase or sale of foreign currencies by central bank during floating exchange rate, but without changing the monetary base.
Yeah.
Based on the two separate transactions like buying and selling foreign exchange and using OMO market.
Yep.
So in the equation that so the money what I curious is that the monetary is by changing or not by using sterilized foreign exchange.
So normally, when a central bank intervenes, it will affect the money supply and thereby the price level. Sterilized intervention is when the central bank sterilizes, that is, doesn't allow changes in reserves to affect the money supply, so as to preserve its competitive advantage or even to gain competitive advantage. That's manipulation. That's against the rules of the fixed rate system. And this is what China did for a decade. Not longer, but for the decade from 2002, more or less, to 2010, 11, it did this. And the best way to see it is to look at the numbers. So, here's China's balance of payments. You know balance of payments. You know that all the balances in the balance of payments add up to zero, right? Double entry bookkeeping. So, the current account, exports minus imports, and the capital account balance, and the change in official reserve assets, those changes all have to add up to zero. It's an identity. It's true by definition of accounting principles. For every debit, there's a credit. So we know in the balance of payments you will see for every country, these always add up to zero. In the 2000s, China ran a large and growing current account surplus, exports minus imports, big trade surplus, with countries all over the world, but especially with the United States, its principal market. During this period, China's penetration of the US market increased threefold. That is, the share of Chinese imports in domestic market increased by over 300% during this period. Then with the financial crisis, this policy ended. But not only China had a current account surplus, they also had a capital account surplus. The capital account surplus is a net inflow of currency. So China was selling a lot of goods and earning dollars, which were flooding into the Chinese banks. And China was borrowing a lot of money. Foreign direct investment, equity investment, bonds, flowing from the private sector into Chinese banks. So they had an enormous surplus of foreign exchange in their commercial banking system during these years. The currency would have appreciated in value. Flood of foreign exchange makes foreign exchange cheaper and the Chinese currency more expensive, which would have corrected the current account surplus. But the central bank intervened to prevent the nominal exchange rate from appreciating. So you can see they bought up all of this foreign exchange in the banking system and put it in their foreign reserves. Now, that should have caused the money supply in China to inflate and the price level to rise, undermining China's competitiveness. But the government didn't want to lose its competitive advantage. So what did the government do? It sterilized. It didn't play by the rules of the game. It should have allowed the currency to appreciate or the money supply to expand and the price level to rise. But no, it wanted both ways. So here, in this diagram, the green here is the increases in foreign reserves held by the Central Bank of China, People's Bank of China. In China, the central bank belongs to the people. In Vietnam, it belongs to the state. Okay, that's the purchases of foreign exchange, the surpluses in the current and the capital account, bought up by China's central bank. Now, that should have caused the base money to just take off. But at the same time, the Central Bank of China was buying foreign exchange. It sold to the commercial banks bonds that it created itself called sterilization bonds. These are bonds issued by the People's Bank of China. So, but when buying foreign reserves, the central bank's putting domestic currency into the banks. And then at the same time, it sells bonds and takes that money right out of the bank. So it controls the money supply. And China had a pretty low rate of inflation over this entire period. That's sterilization. That is cheating. That is currency manipulation. No way around it. But none of the literature I read explains that this, and this alone, is currency manipulation. Not intervening. Not buying foreign exchange is not intervening. Selling bonds at the same time is what's not fair. That's sterilizing intervention. Not fair. Well, with the financial crisis in 2010, they pretty much stopped. And if I have the data all the way out to today, and there's no more reserve purchases in China. In fact, China's reserves have gone down in recent years from a high of $4 trillion in 2008 to about $3 trillion today. Still, China holds more foreign reserves than any other country in the world, by far. But they're not intervening and sterilizing like they did during this period. So I want to explain, why did they do that in this period? What was the cost to China of this policy? And were there any benefits? Okay? That's my challenge. Any questions? Oh, here, you can't have a lecture in econ without a diagram, right? Which is a bunch of equations that I'm too lazy to write out. And this is just to illustrate the point. So, you all know what the production possibility frontier is. In this diagram, it's that black line, HH prime. That's the production possibility. We divide the economy into two sectors, just to illustrate. Tradable goods. This is where all China's dynamic, labor-intensive, export-oriented manufacturing firms are. And non-tradables, state-owned enterprises that are protected by protection, and other sectors of the economy where goods are not traded. It's an artificial distinction, but it's useful. So here is our initial equilibrium at P. The community indifference curve is tangent at P. That means that that is the relative price of non-tradable goods. The price of non-tradables over the price of tradables. Here, it's right here, exchange rate. This is simply the real exchange rate. The price of domestically produced goods divided by the price of goods that's price is set in the world market, which is for a small country, all their exports and imports, times the exchange rate to put things in a common currency. That's the real exchange rate. So at this initial equilibrium P, the real exchange rate is given by the slope of the line of K prime. Right? Okay. Now, suppose that a country wants to promote its tradable goods sector. Why? Why would a country want to do that? Well, there are many reasons why a country might want to do it. It may be that productivity growth is higher in the tradable goods sector than in the non-tradable goods sector. So let's put more resources in that sector. Of course, we have to take them out of the other sector. But there's a cost. Or it could be that, and I think this is what I'm going to argue is the case for China, which when it began reforms had about 600, 700, 800 million people unemployed in the rural countryside. This was the best way to give them jobs in labor-intensive activities, not in the state enterprises, which are capital-intensive and hire many people. So there are many reasons why you can do that, okay? Of course, you could, so suppose we want to promote the tradable goods sector. Well, one thing we could do is to devalue the exchange rate, the currency. Raise the price of foreign exchange. That means we'll import less and export more. And give a competitive advantage to the tradable goods sector. Of course, at the expense of the non-tradable goods sector. Everything has a cost, right? So suppose our target is to push tradable production up to this level at P prime, okay? And we devalue the currency. Well, you see what's happened. By devaluing the currency, our production of tradables goes up, and our production of non-tradable goes down. But our demand for non-tradables goes up. Non-tradables, since they're not tradable, their price is determined in the domestic market. Tradables, because you're a small country, you can't influence the price for any given exchange rate, are exogenous. But the price of non-tradables are endogenous. So the devaluation creates an excess demand for non-tradable goods. They're cheaper, people want to buy more. But because they're cheaper, people want to produce less. So there's an excess demand for non-tradables. The consequence would be, of course, the price of non-tradables will go up. And as the price of non-tradables goes up, the currency appreciates. And we're right back where we were. Didn't work. So here's something that a lot of economists got wrong in the big debate about China. A devaluation does not give a country competitive advantage for long, because a devaluation creates an excess demand for non-tradable goods and pushes up their price and negates the effect of the devaluation. Many people said China's advantage was they devalued the currency. Every time Vietnam devalues its currency, American people in the Treasury Department say Vietnam is trying to get a competitive advantage. But a devaluation doesn't give you a sustainable competitive advantage because it will push up the prices in your country, and that advantage will be taken away. Okay? So, if China wants to push production of tradables up to P prime, it has to devalue, and it has to do something else too. It has to reduce the level of expenditure to the level L of prime. Because there we have, in a different curve, there we have supply equals demand for non-tradable goods. We demand this much non-tradables and we produce this much non-tradables. Of course, in the tradable sector, we have a big surplus. Because we're producing way up here, but we're consuming this much. But that's not a problem. That doesn't affect the price because we're a small country. Well, it might, because all of this surplus is going to go into reserves, which is going to go into money, unless the central bank sterilizes the purchase of all this foreign exchange surplus. And that's why manipulation of the currency, exchange rate protection, is sterilized foreign exchange intervention. And we just saw that China intervened heavily. Okay, that's not a problem. But it sterilized its intervention. That's a problem. Right? Now, this indifference curve here is telling us the welfare from current consumption. But China is also accumulating a lot of foreign assets, which is future consumption. But this must always be less than the present value of future consumption, because otherwise we would have invested on our own. So that's the story. Intervention isn't bad, is not manipulation. Sterilized intervention is manipulation. And that's what we saw China do in the 2000s. Not since 2010, not before 2010, but during that one decade, when they China amassed went from very low reserves to $4 trillion in reserves. $4 trillion is almost equal to China's GDP. Unheard of in history. Intervention so massive. Why did they do that? Why did they do that? Why did they sacrifice current consumption to amass $4 trillion in reserves? Why did they lend money to the richest country in the world? Why did the Chinese households that are poor, why did they save so much to lend to the fat, rich Americans? Why? Why? Why didn't they spend that money at home? Why didn't they invest at home? Why did they invest in foreign reserves? Why? That's a big cost. What's the benefit that could justify that policy? That policy also earned a lot of bad will in the world for China. In the United States and Europe, everybody saying, you are currency manipulators. You are not playing by the rules of the game. You are stealing our jobs. Yes, they did. But maybe it was to their advantage. And if it's to their advantage, why shouldn't they do it? Doesn't every country do what's in their own best interest? Right? That's the questions we're going to answer. Oh, I showed you this, right? Yeah. So this is just the buying foreign exchange and sterilizing. And this diagram just shows you how they sterilize. They issue bonds and they raise the reserve requirement ratio. Both reduce the monetary effect of a change in the base money. You know, in Vietnam, I have a slide on Vietnam later. Vietnam usually uses the reserve requirement ratio to manage its money supply. Raises the reserve requirement ratio, requires banks to hold more money with the central bank or less money with the central bank. China used it heavily when nobody wanted to buy the bonds of the central bank anymore. Okay, this diagram doesn't add much. It just shows you that what happens when an economy is growing. Suppose that the tradable goods sector is enjoying productivity growth more than the non-tradable goods sector, which is usually the case. Then you can see the production possibility frontier will shift out with a bias. And as a result of that, if we keep the exchange rate fixed, we'll begin producing more and more tradable goods and demand less and less non-tradable goods because they're expensive. And that will put a rise in the price of non-tradable goods. We have to sterilize to keep losing production and employment. Okay, now let's talk about the costs and benefits. So, in the paper I go into this in more detail, but basically the cost to China of accumulating $4 trillion in reserves is the opportunity cost of using that money at home instead of parking it in the US government bonds. Right? That's the real cost of sterilized intervention. You're taking your domestic savings and investing them in foreign assets instead of investing them in the domestic economy, in the export-oriented sectors. That's the cost. So what I wanted to do, and I haven't succeeded, is get a rigorous estimate of these costs, but I couldn't do that. But I have a back-of-the-envelope calculation. So first thing I have to do to measure this cost, opportunity cost of putting savings in the US instead of at home for China, is to estimate how much of the reserve accumulation was the result of the policy and not just normal banking procedure where you save, you accumulate reserves as your economy grows because you need precaution against it. So I gave a very generous measure of precautionary to bias the calculation against my thesis, make the cost less. And so what I do then is calculate year by year the opportunity cost of all of these increases in reserves. Okay? And I use a study done by a former PhD student of mine who has meticulously estimated the rate of return on foreign assets of China and foreign liabilities of China. So you can see here there's a big mismatch between assets and liabilities in China. Most of China's assets are foreign exchange reserves, US government bonds. And most of China's liabilities is foreign direct investment. So you see you have a mismatch. China also has some foreign direct investment in other countries, some stocks, holds, equities, and other bank debt. But most of it is Central Bank of China holding US dollars in the form of US government debt, which it earns a very low interest rate. Well, they got about 2.5% yield. Here they got more because the dollar appreciated a bit, but it's pretty low. And then you have China's liabilities. Okay? Mostly foreign direct investment in China. That's a debt that China owes to other countries who have invested directly in their economy. They also have foreigners who bought their equities and bought other things, other kinds of portfolios. You see a big mismatch here. China is long in debt and short in real investment. They borrow long-term direct investment, and they lend out currency mismatch. And so we can do a weighted average of these things, and we come up with an opportunity cost of about 2% of, in other words, the return on their accumulation of foreign reserves is about 2% below the return that they could get in the economy by some assumptions. And so you multiply this out and you come to a number of approximately $100 billion. That's 2% times, minus 2% if you like, times the level of reserves in each and every year. That's how much they lost by not investing in the real economy at home. 100 billion, it's a lot of money, right? 100 billion used to be Vietnam's GDP. I don't know, today it's probably 200 billion, right? What's GDP in Vietnam? Is it 200 billion? Maybe not yet, but upwards of 200 billion. Anyway, it's a lot of money. $100 billion. So what could justify that? What benefit could there be to justify China investing in saving? We're talking about the country that's the fastest growing in the world, and so presumably has the highest rate of return on investment in the world. Taking its savings and not investing at home with a high return, but instead putting them into government securities abroad. What could justify that? That's the question. That's the question. So here's a little bit of theory. If you've done your trade theory, you'll know that currency manipulation is simply exchange rate protection, that is favoring one sector at the expense of the other. That's what protection is. Tariffs, quotas do the same thing as sterilizing prevention. They favor one sector at the expense of other sectors. In this case, we favor the tradable goods sector at the expense of the non-tradable goods sector. We're favoring the export-oriented, labor-intensive manufacturing firms by keeping their price competitiveness high. That's what China was doing. And so what can be the benefit of that? We all know, you've done your trade theory maybe, I hope. Maybe I can teach you someday. You know that there's consumer loss and producer gain to protection, right? And usually the losses from protection exceed the gains from protection. And so net terms, protecting your economy is against your best interest, against your welfare. It doesn't allow you to maximize your welfare. The market, if the market works perfectly, will always maximize welfare. Right? Came out to that, right? Cost-benefit analysis. Right? So to justify intervention of any kind, a tariff, a quota, or exchange rate protection, there has to be some benefit. If the market works perfectly, it's very difficult to justify protection. But markets don't always work perfectly. Some markets fail because of externalities. Externalities. Costs and benefits that are not taken into account in the market, like pollution. Right? Pollution is a cost, but nobody pays for clean air. So there's a cost. That's justification for the government to intervene. In fact, all justification for government intervention in macro or micro terms must come down to externalities, market failures. If by definition the economy works perfectly, there are no externalities, then the market will give us the right price. Any intervention will upset that and cause a cost. To get a net benefit, we must have benefits that exceed the cost. Every government policy, even if it's beneficial, has a cost to somebody. Again, no solutions, just trade-offs. But sometimes the trade-offs are worthwhile. If the people who lose less than what the people who gain, then the trade-off is worthwhile. That's what I want to find out for China. So were there market failures, for example, in the tradable goods sector, that justify a subsidy, which is what exchange rate protection is, a subsidy to the export sector? Is there? There's an important paper by an economist named Danny Roderick, famous development economist, who argues, yes, there are externalities everywhere. And he wrote a paper trying to show that in China this is especially relevant, but he could never measure or even identify externalities. So the market failure is one. Nobody can find them. Because they're external, they're invisible. They may exist, but you can't see them. Anyway, in China, there were no markets to fail until Deng Xiaoping came along in 1978. Before that, there were no markets to fail. There were no markets. But there was failure. Because at the end of Mao's reign in China, well, in 1976, but Deng Xiaoping came to power in 78. In 1978, you could see the failure. It was everywhere. 800 million people without work. GDP falling, starvation. It was a disaster. So there was failure to take care of. 800 million unemployed people is a big problem. Okay? That was a big problem. And so, what did Deng Xiaoping, and after Deng Xiaoping, what policy did they adopt? They abandoned central planning and adopted market institutions gradually. And today, China is a thriving market economy. Not a perfect market economy, lots of government intervention still, but it's not a centrally planned economy. Deng Xiaoping, I believe, did not undertake these momentous reforms because he believed in capitalism. No, he wanted to save the party from disaster, because after the Cultural Revolution, well, how many, 30 million people died in that, the party didn't look too good. So he adopted market institutions to revive the legitimacy of the party. And look what happened. Doesn't matter why he did it. He did it. And it worked. It worked like hell. Right? Yeah. So my argument here is that in China, there may be market failures. I can't find them. Nobody can. But there surely is political failure in the form of unemployment. The disastrous level of unemployment. And putting those unemployed people to work is a benefit to society, creating income and jobs. And how do you best do that? Well, the best way to do it is to expand. You have to invest to create jobs. And where should you invest? You should invest where labor productivity is low and capital productivity is high, which is in the labor-intensive, export-oriented manufacturing sector. And that's what China did. That's what China did. Spectacularly. Spectacular. So here's just some rough data. unemployment, but here's the point. Between 1980 and 2012, China put to work, this is measured employment, it's probably more than this by far, 343 million people. 343 million people went to work, found new jobs. And where did these people find jobs? In the urban, non-SOE sector, the private sector, by and large, in the urban countryside. Some of them came out of the rural sector, but not that many. Mostly it's all new jobs. All new jobs. In the industrial sector, we have here 155 million people found new jobs in the industrial sector. Mostly in the private, export-oriented manufacturing sector. That's like here. State enterprises, by and large, shed employment because they raise their productivity. So you need to put your labor, or you put your investment in the labor-intensive sector to generate this employment. And that's what China did. So does that justify the cost of $100 billion in diverted savings into U.S. government bonds? No. Again, I need a general equilibrium model to answer this question precisely. I have to know what the exchange rate would have been if China hadn't followed this policy. And I don't have such a model, and I don't have faith in such a model. So what I did is I said, okay, let me go at it a different way. How many jobs, how much, remember the cost of savings is $100 billion. So how many jobs is that equivalent to? So the average wage in manufacturing is about $3,000 per year in China during this period. You divide one by the other, you come up with 33 million jobs. Which means that if China created 33 million jobs, the cost just equal the benefits. The cost was 100 billion, and the jobs created to match that is 33. But China created well over 100 million jobs. So to me, there's no question that this policy was beneficial to China. Absolutely. They had hundreds of millions of unemployed people. They put hundreds of millions of people to work, to earn income, to generate GDP, and sustain themselves. And in the 2000s, after China got into the WTO and could really exploit its comparative advantage for the first time, exports just took off. And investment, massive amounts of investment went into the export-oriented manufacturing sector. And jobs in that sector just increased dramatically. Now, if China had not intervened in the exchange market and sterilized its intervention, the currency would have appreciated. The competitiveness of Chinese exports would have deteriorated, and those jobs would have been lost. Maybe they would have been sent back to the countryside. They didn't want that to happen. That's how I interpret the policy. Even they may not say this is their policy, this is my interpretation of the policy. They needed to keep the people happy and provide them with jobs and income because they were destitute. Central planning didn't work. Mao's experiments with Cultural Revolution was a disaster, and with the Great Leap Forward before that was a disaster. They needed to get the economy going. They needed to put their investment where it would do the most good in labor-intensive, export-oriented manufacturing. And that's where it went. But they had to protect that sector from deterioration in its competitiveness by intervening and fixing the exchange rate and then preventing the monetization of its reserve accumulation to sterilize. I'm almost done. So I like this story for China. But let me just end by telling you about the other side of the story. There's another side of the story, and that's the rest of the world. So the most famous international economists in the United States, MIT and Harvard, have been doing a lot of empirical work. And they discovered that in the 2000s, the United States suffered a massive loss of jobs. 2.4 million jobs were lost in the manufacturing sector. The course, Donald Trump loves this statistic because, you know, he's always saying, China, 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 China. China's killing us. China's killing us. China's manipulating its currency and cheating and killing us. And we're losing jobs. Jobs. What's important for an economy? 3 things. Jobs, jobs, and jobs. And we've been losing 2.4 million jobs to China. Now, in this literature, they make a big mistake. They say that this China trade shock, this expansion of exports in the 2000s, was the result of the United States giving China permanent normal trade relations. Actually, that's illogical. The real reason is because China sterilized its foreign exchange intervention. In fact, if this is what sparked exports, and there had been no sterilization, the currency would have appreciated, and the shock would have petered out, died out very soon. So what sustained it for a decade was sterilized intervention. And the proof of my argument here is Vietnam. Vietnam, China went in WTO in 2001. Vietnam went in 2007. And what happened in 2006 and 2007? Euphoria struck, money flowed in, 25% of GDP as capital inflow. The currency was appreciating in nominal terms. It had been depreciating at 6% a year for a decade. Then in 2007 and 2008, it began to appreciate. Oh, the government bought up a lot of foreign exchange. This is reserve accumulation, intervention, but was not successful in sterilizing. And what happened? Of course, you all remember this. The surge of inflation with monetary growth. In 2007, 2008, the money supply, which had been growing at about 12% a year, went up to 50, 60%. The inflation rate, which had been down around 5 to 6%, went up to over 30% on an annual basis. The trade deficit rose to about 30% of GDP. Vietnam was in trouble. And then the financial crisis came, and you had to start pumping. So in this period, the government was trying to cool the economy down. And then a tsunami hit from North America called the financial crisis, and then they had to heat the economy back up. And then in 2011, whoop, too hot, turn it back down. But Vietnam makes the point very clearly. Vietnam had also, like China, a surge of foreign exchange earnings, mostly from foreign capital, but was not successful at sterilization. And as a result, got inflation. And that would have happened in China too, if they hadn't sterilized. Vietnam makes the point. So that's a technical point, but I think it's an important point. Sterilized intervention is cheating on the game. That's currency manipulation, not intervention. Vietnam intervened heavily, buying up foreign exchange. Its reserves went way up, but its money base went way up too. And then its prices went way up. So in the end, Vietnam had to sell off all that foreign exchange that it accumulated within a decade. Buying foreign exchange, selling foreign exchange. No sterilization. So finally, this is it. What are the implications? This policy of China cost the United States, let's take those studies at face value, I don't believe it, but let's say, okay, cost the United States 2.4 million jobs, but generated for China maybe 100 million, who knows. So what are the implications of that? Is the United States justified in criticizing China, for manipulating its currency? If China says, hey, but it's in our interest. We had a lot of unemployed people to go to. Mr. Trump, you say all the time, 3 things are important. Jobs, jobs, and jobs. Why aren't they important in China? Why are they only American jobs that are important and not Chinese jobs? And hey, by the way, Mr. Trump, we sold you a lot of goods at low price, and your consumers benefited from it. hey, Mr. Trump, we lend you $4 trillion at low interest rates, which you use to finance a war in Iraq and Afghanistan. We didn't tell you how to spend it, but that's where you spend it. And American households bought a lot of houses they couldn't afford. Because our low interest rates, we made you forget your financial wisdom. So, you see, I say for China, this was net positive benefit. There was a cost, a big cost, $100 billion in diverted savings. But given the hundreds of millions of people that were put to work, I'd say it was money, it was a cost they could afford. Right? And the United States, yes, we lost maybe 2.4 million jobs. But we got a lot of other benefits you haven't even calculated. So I don't know whether the United States is better off or not. Suppose the United States is not better off and China is better off. So what does that mean? Who cares? You know anybody who has the authority to maximize world welfare? Is there any agency, the UN or the World Bank, whose job it is to maximize world welfare? No. The way the world works is that every country is supposed to be sovereign, and every country makes its policies to benefit itself. Often they don't benefit themselves with their policies. Often they adopt bad policies and hurt themselves. It's your own damn fault. If you adopt bad policies and have welfare losses, it's your fault. It's not somebody else's fault. Right? Lots of countries put up high protection barriers, tariffs and quotas, thinking they're going to help the economy. Well, they help some people, but they hurt a lot more people. More. It's your fault. Your policy is your fault, your responsibility. There's nobody there to trade off U.S. losses in China. So the United States should follow policies that benefit itself, and China should follow policies that benefit itself. And Trump should just shut up his mouth and be quiet, not be blaming China for all the failures in the United States. That's my bottom line. I'd like to hear your case.
Anyone who calculate the welfare of the U.S., for example, 100 million jobs created in China, they get salary. They will buy Apple products from the U.S., GM car from the U.S. Anyone calculate that?
I'm sure that someone has done it, but I wouldn't believe it because you need to have a general equilibrium model. And you have to know the parameters of all the elasticities of supply and demand. So that's why I feel that my paper is still useful, is that the benefit is so great relative to the cost that it probably would hold up to, for the United States, the loss of jobs. Actually, these famous economists publish these papers, at least 10 of them. It's in the paper. You see a footnote of all this literature cited there. Very irresponsible, saying, you know, this is a cost, this is a cost. Okay, so what? There's a benefit somewhere. What does it cost without the benefit? It's just a number. It doesn't have any welfare significance. They also argue that trade is not Pareto optimal. You know what Pareto optimal is, right? That's when something, everybody benefits, right? Pareto optimal. You benefit without costing anybody else anything. That's Pareto optimal. Well, they say trade is not Pareto optimal because it has losses, and we have no compensation mechanism whereby the winners can compensate the losers. That's true of everything. Every change in the economy has costs and benefits. And we do not have a mechanism for compensating the losers with the gains of the winners. If we did, then we could know its way to Pareto optimal because the winners would be willing to compensate the losers and still be better off. We don't have that mechanism.
my second point is I would argue on the global welfare, global government, something like that. In the private to climate change, something like climate change. If each country follows its own narrative, and then you never can deal with climate change problem, right? So,
Well, if every country perceives climate change to be not a problem, not to pay the cost of lowering the CO2 emissions, if every country perceives that it's not beneficial to engage in policies limiting climate change, then it must be, they must be right. Right? I mean, this is the problem, is that the climate change is a brilliant externality, right? It's not only, it's also a global externality.
that's global.
And nobody has authority to manage the atmosphere. And so it doesn't get managed. And so we see global warming.
So I mean that when we are trying we are trying to combat with the climate change, and hopefully we come up with some global mechanism to deal with that. And if we have something like global mechanism, why we don't think that global mechanism apply to something like this, like
Well,
the economic.
The economists would say, there are going to be benefits by doing climate change policy, but there's going to be costs. Who are going to get the benefits? Future generations.
Yeah.
Who's going to pay the cost? This generation. So we in this generation say, hey, why should we pay the cost? What did future generations ever do for us? So, this is why the success in this field has been so limited, because there's a lot of people alive today and paying taxes are going to pay the cost of global climate change policy, right? And they say, we're not getting any benefit. That's why I'm pessimistic about them.
Give us some very interesting data. These are very useful. But I have a thinking whether we add up some other information in the data, for example, pollution. Because I think that if US, America did not import product from China, they have to produce the entire product. And what level of pollution America have to deal with? And I thought that when we analyze cost benefits, there are the difficult is that there are many kind of costs and benefits which we cannot measure.
Yeah.
So I think that's, and besides that we have to deal with something very subjective, because when we evaluate something and cost, something and benefit, it belongs to our subjective view among the instruments. So I think it's very complicated.
That's why we have Professor Nam teaching this course.
So I think sometimes, because I was trained in economics and I love the field of study, but maybe one big question I always have to deal with whether the intervention or the suppression of economics is really good or not. And I thought that many things, for example, when we suggest some policy, we do it with very good intention. But many policies turn out messy. So, so I think that
impact of trade. There's a big literature on that. It's very interesting because the U.S. not only imports goods, it exports goods. And so, you know, it's producing pollution to produce exports. And it's saving pollution from imports. So trade should, in the long run, balance. Right? So people have looked at that empirically. It's pretty much a non-issue, I would say. There was a lot of excitement in the United Nations about this moving pollution from one country to another. And I don't know if you know the name Larry Summers. He was vice president of the World Bank, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, and president of Harvard. He got fired from all those jobs. When he was in the World Bank, he made a statement that got him fired. He said, hey, some countries are more tolerant of inflation, of pollution than other countries, so they have a comparative advantage as a haven for pollution, like poor countries. So he said, yes, let's just send all the polluting production to poor countries. And obviously, that was not politically correct thing to say. He got fired. But your question, or your point, I think it just underscores my opening line. There are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. And the other thing is, economics is not conducted in a vacuum. It's conducted in political realm. Economists can tell you what's the best policy. Perhaps, I mean, they can rank policies. Okay, a tariff is better than a quota, is better than a subsidy, or something like that. But economists don't make policy. Politicians make policy. And politicians may listen to the economists, tell them what the policy should be from an economic point of view, but they don't necessarily, implement that suggestion or recommendation. They're going to do. Everybody is maximizing. You are a consumer. You maximize your consumer welfare. You are in the market selling your labor. You try to maximize your wage income or your profit. Politicians are doing the same thing. They're maximizing their rent-seeking abilities, and they're, So what we get, and out of all the complications of economics, then we have to add on to them the complications of the political system. And we haven't even talked about science yet, which is also complicated. So social science is much more difficult than natural science or physical sciences. They have laboratories where they can do experiments and testing. In society, we can't replay history and see what would have happened if China hadn't sterilized its intervention. So our job is much more difficult. We should be paid much more money.
The indication has in terms of employment generations between US and China, but for the term of welfare in other respects, like the US consumer can benefit from tradable goods from China. That means that they pay less for their consumption.
Right.
And then they may be pay more for taxation, like for income tax. And then the U.S. government can use this tax for this tax revenue to pay for subsidy for unemployed people in U.S.
Yeah.
By this way, I think the U.S. can maintain more or less. They can maintain or compensate the cost of the loss from.
We had a policy that wasn't big enough, but did try to do that. We used to have something called trade adjustment systems. So workers who lost their jobs due to competition from foreign products could get retraining and benefits, move their house to find new jobs and stuff like that. We used to have such a policy, incomplete, too small. But the idea, as you can point out very correctly, is compensating. So, yes, but difficult to do that.
Yes.
Compensate. You know, this is all micro. You know, this is the public good problem. People have to reveal how much the reservation price is for goods, and so forth, which clearly, yes, U.S. probably benefits net
Yes.
consumption, welfare, and other things. But the politicians, why do they just say three things are important? Jobs, jobs, and jobs. Why do they just fixate on jobs? Why? Why don't they say consumers' ability to buy goods with their scarce income? Why isn't that important to the politician? Anybody have an idea? Why doesn't Trump say, oh, we...
He's only reading Wikipedia definition of currency manipulation.
But let's assume that he is a rational person, which is a very risky assumption.
I think that's mainly because he tried to get the power from the people.
He's maximizing his
Absolutely right.
Yeah.
He maximizing his vote
Yeah.
capturing ability. Absolutely. So, in the United States, many of this 2.4 million jobs were lost in about 5 states. Pennsylvania and Ohio. This is the what's called, used to be called the Rust Belt, because it's old industry, already old and rusty. The Rust Belt. Those north central states where industrialization in the United States began. That's where most of these jobs were lost. And Trump followed a very clever strategy. He didn't go to California, where Silicon Valley and Hollywood, to get votes, because he knew that the people, rich people in the West hate him, and they do. He went where the poor people who lost their jobs to imports from China, the factories closed down. He went there, and he said, the only thing that matters is jobs, jobs. Your job. Only your job matters. Not exporters also have to work, right? So if U.S. imports less, we're going to export more. Export less. China's going to put restrictions on the U.S. Retaliate. We have a trade war. Then, but no, he went to where the import competing industries were, and he bought votes. Yeah.
I have a question that in recent years, the pressures of seeking export, raising labor price, and especially for automation. So maybe this phenomenon create problem of unemployment. So is it suitable for China using sterilized intervention anymore when even the automation problem happen in all over the world?
Well, that's a good point. By the way, many studies have looked at the impact on wages and employment from international competition, and the U.S. is a lot of research on the U.S. And it used to find, before these recent studies, that imports had a small effect. It was mostly technology change that led to unemployment in manufacturing, automation, and all that stuff. Right? And then this surge of trade in the 2000s, which was phenomenal because China got into WTO and faced a big market, and they had hundreds of millions of unemployed people they put to work making stuff to sell in Europe and the United States mostly. But yeah, if the United States is successful in Trump's policy of protecting against imports, immigration, wages are going to go up, and that's going to induce more innovation, labor-saving technology change. Yeah. Labor-saving technology change is an ongoing thing. That's how we get rich. That's how rich countries got rich, is by raising productivity through changing technology. Right? That's the engine of growth, if you like. And you can make that engine run a little faster, maybe, or change its direction. Doing manual kind of labor can be done with machines, and it's going to happen. And we never had more on the board. Yeah.
What's your questions? So the first one is, so I think that you actually making for the policy for the sterilizing policy for China whole. So the first one was as you said, they have a policy for labor. But the other one is might be an economic benefit as well. So if we compare the cost of monetary of losing the opportunity cost of sterilization and the economic reward of China, you can see that there's an economic expenditure besides the labor expenditure. And my second question is, so your study shows that this policy benefits China. So would that mean that all the countries should follow the same policy as well?
No, I would say every country faces different challenges and opportunities.
So
That's a
countries,
famous word in Vietnamese newspapers, right? Challenge and opportunity. Every article on the economy of Vietnam starts with, we are facing challenges and opportunities. Every country faces challenges and opportunities, and the challenges are different, so the policies. But what about Vietnam? Vietnam today isn't much different from China in the 2000s, right? You still have massive unemployment, not on the scale of China, but scale down to Vietnamese size. It's still a lot of people residing in the rural countryside. I think as many as 80% of the population is in the rural area.
No, 60%.
60%, okay? And that 60% of people in the rural countryside generate about 25% of GDP, right? So right there you see a problem. Those people have to find employment outside of the rural sector, right? And so you need perhaps to make the market work, and then if the market doesn't work sufficiently, you need some policies to. But right now, the way capital is allocated in Vietnam, it doesn't go to those more labor-intensive export-oriented manufacturing. And so, because the domestic financial markets don't allocate the capital efficiently, so that sector, export-oriented sector in Vietnam, is being dominated by foreign investment, right? The Samsung and all the rest. A lot of that, those products produced by foreign investors in Vietnam could be produced by domestic investors as well, like they are in China. But there's too little private investment in manufacturing. Private investors prefer to put their money into real estate, right? Because they don't have profits in the long term, supposedly. And real estate's not that good of an investment in the long haul. You may make some money on a real estate boom, and many people have, which kind of, but for the economy in the long run, we need to go where productivity growth is high. Productivity growth is high in industry. And productivity growth at Vietnam's level of development is particularly high in the labor-intensive manufacturing, where many products you can ship from one to another. You can climb up the ladder of comparative advantage more easily in the manufacturing sector. So Vietnam has quá nhiều. Cung có cơ hội. So again, economists like the man here, they have ideas, but he's not making policy. He's doing something much more important. He's creating human capital.
We are in
Very important. So, this issue The problem is the politicians, like the one in the United States who's now the president, they make the matters worse by making arguments that are just false. Just false. And they fool the people into thinking that if you put a limit on imports from China, you're going to do something good for the nation. It's just, that's why Ricardo invented the principle of comparative advantage in 1740 to teach the government of England that they should restrict the imports of corn. You get more, you do better when you follow your comparative advantage. Trump was not do it. Any other questions?
I don't know whether it's a question or a command, because I thought that integration was global tendencies. It means that, for example, you see that many economic groups at EU, European nations, EU, many other groups, but and people in the past, they talk a lot about perhaps one union institution to solve global issues. But now, that belief seems unreal, seem failed, and because after the duty from EU, and people thought that it's impossible to have a local integration to solve the many big issues that the world is facing. How do you think about that? Do you think that do you believe in that point of view or not? Do you really believe that in the near future we will have a local in this field or local organization with efficient?
Yeah, I think you raised an important issue, which we will face as a challenge in the future. And that is globalization. Really, there are two big waves of globalization. The first at the end of the 19th century, and then after the Second World War. Globalization didn't begin in the 1950s. There was globalization, and there was collapse during the Great Depression and the Second World War, and then re-globalization occurred after the Second World War. And who benefited the most from that globalization were the developing countries. It wasn't globalization that caused it, whatever that is. It was countries began to reform their economy. And, all over the world, there's been a massive increase in income, per capita income, unprecedented in world history. So countries like Taiwan and Korea were as poor as Vietnam 50, 60 years ago. Today are as rich as any country in Europe. And China, had massive poverty, and Vietnam too. And today that's much, much less. And people said, this is the positive effects of globalization. Bringing us together, all the markets joining together, labor markets joining, capital markets joining, goods markets coming together, integrating, is creating all this good stuff. But what's happened recently is that we now see that not everyone benefits equally from the positive forces of globalization, right? And so now countries are beginning to move backward. In Europe, I think the Brexit issue was too much political integration. The EU became the government of Europe without the authority, without being elected. And the people didn't like it. They were passing all kinds of laws in Brussels that affect everybody in Bologna and Bellingham and so forth. So people didn't like that. Plus immigration increased dramatically. And that caused a lot of social conflicts. So then countries now start to do like Britain, Brexit, disintegration, deintegration. Yeah. And that now has many people very worried, because this is something that could snowball. If Britain can get out of the EU, then any country can get out of the EU, right? And who knows, maybe California will declare independence of the United States. We hope so. Well, we fought a civil war over that, 100, whatever years, 150 years ago, the Civil War was about sexing, South exit.
Nationalism seems to be increasing all over the world. And if any country only concerned about this or about what the world will be.
And the other thing, nationalism and populism. Populism is where politicians appeal to the lowest common denominator. And then you get all kinds of, globalization is kind of uplifting in a way. So let's all get along. And nationalism is, no, we're just take care of ourselves, we don't help the neighbor. I think there is a bit of a move like that, but if you were wanting to make a lot of money, you could write a book and predict the world falling apart. But I don't think it will. I think it will just mumble along. No solutions. Just trade-offs. Well, I really enjoyed meeting you, and hope I have another opportunity sometime in the future. I'm bringing 8 of master's degree students from Johns Hopkins here to this university on Monday. They are in a seminar which I'm leading at Johns Hopkins on economic development in Vietnam. So they each have to write an essay or a short paper on some issue about the Vietnamese economy, maybe the rice sector, coffee sector, exchange rate, industrial policy, and so forth. Each one has a different topic, and they will come here on Monday, and we will visit the university, and we will go up to the Central Highlands, to Chang, and to Hanoi, visit ministries and universities and businesses. It will be fun.
Yeah. So on Monday from 12 to 2 p.m. right? We have a meeting with presentation and discussion among master students from Johns Hopkins University and students and young lecturers from School of Economics. So if you have time, just come and join with us.
We have an international group. We have people from China, from Thailand, from Canada. Yes. Great.
And after the student people somehow to interview them, find out during the
We have what? Have to do what?
for example, some
Some report about our trip? Yeah, maybe. I have to see. I haven't planned that yet. But maybe it's a good idea. We will.
because I thought that after a trip, every student will have very different point of view.
Yeah.
For example, I am Vietnamese. I cannot see the issue like that. He or she will see
Yeah,
from a
that's
And
interesting.
I thought that really interesting, especially the young people.
Yeah. And none has come to Vietnam before,